Yeah, get that chaos training, boy. What injuries? What tweaks? Just nothing but maximum gain. Specific. I mean, this is specific training. You do not want to do anything that does not look like what you are going to do on the field. I mean, hey, things are going to hit your helmet. There's going to be birds and shit. What could you have possibly learned from Ben Patrick? Whew, this one broke my brain. Those of you guys that know Zach, he's an Olympic lifter. He runs a good YouTube channel. You should check out his channel. He's been around for a minute grinding. He's a pretty strong dude. He has like a 375 clean and jerk, and he's built like a giraffe, which I think is pretty crazy. But there's a lot of lifting shenanigans on his channel. But he has a very special, kind of lean when it comes to identifying bullshit in the industry and charlatans. It's kind of his brand. When he did that video with More Plates, More Dates about Liver King, he had the piece in the middle about charlatans. And he specifically said that Joel Seedman's his mortal enemy, which I think is hilarious because of just kind of the bullshit that Seedman puts out and the way he handles his channel and stuff. So a lot of good stuff coming from Zach. So I was really excited to see him sit down. Now, for those of you that don't know Seedman, and I don't know who doesn't know Seedman at this point. I mean, come on, the man. Let me see if I can pull Seedman up. I mean, Seedman is just a legend, just an absolute. I mean, this is pretty tame for Seedman right here. His favorite mobility drill. Everything's just offset, single leg. If he can add fuckery to it, he does. I've never seen him. He has millions of these. I've never seen him do the same thing twice. So, he gets there early to think, how many different ways can I rig up bands, medicine balls? How can I use as much of the gym equipment? Everything's offset. He's constantly doing this. Negatives, like changing the tempo in really random, sporadic ways. And it's all paired with everything's the most. It's the most difficult, the most challenging. And he's known for the 90-degree max range of motion thing. This is a perfect squat for athletic development. And of course that gets everybody's jimmys rustled because it's known when you're a lifter, right? That's a sign of a real man. You squat to depth, and we get indoctrinated with it, which, it is what it is. I mean, there's a lot more subtlety to it. There's a lot more context to it, but where people used to go in and do whatever on leg day, last couple decades, we got indoctrinated with depth. You got to hit depth, bro. And it's good. There's a lot of value to depth. But yeah, this triggers the fuck out of people. And that's a special pet peeve of Zach. So anyways, Joel got kind of semi-destroyed by Israel not that long ago, maybe a year or so ago. And Mike was saint-like in the way that he handled it. He was so reserved. He wasn't like normal internet debate bro dickhead. He knew his shit. He had the studies, and he pushed him point by point. But the optics of it weren't. It wasn't the bloodbath you would look for. And this is what Zach talks about. The things that Joel does, if you're looking at it from that point of view as like a huckster, a fitness charlatan, the things they come up with are never about what's actually effective, what is actually closer to being true as far as a training statement goes that you can build off of. It's about defining that in-group that satisfies the need for an identity that juxtaposes you to everybody else. And we all have that. We all need that. If you lift weights, you get it. It's you and the normies. But if you can niche down and you're like, I train with the guy that has me do this stuff, it's the inside, the secret, the tricks of the pros, that carries weight. And if you can float around in the middle ground, kind of the gray area of technical jargon, it can sound very intelligent and reasoned to people that don't know any better. So he has a big following. He sells his books for hundreds of dollars. And it's all because he posts stuff like this. Just thousands. Notice this is literally everything he posts. How many posts does our buddy Joel have? 2,400 posts, and 99.999% of them are this. Real quick though, shout out. I gotta give the sponsors love. Barbell Apparel. Their stealth hoodies are amazing. They've been a huge supporter of this channel. Our shirts are in. Let me pull up the shirts, guys. I know you guys. Here we go. So I was really proud of this one. Big dreams, bad genes. You got his arms should be shorter if it was going to be true to life. His Godzilla tee. But I was really proud of how that came out. And then We also got Strength Conquerors. I talked them into a front print. I hate back prints. So this is like all I wear now. But their shirts are super comfortable. Obviously, pants are comfortable. You get a free stealth hoodie, like $88 if you spend $99 or more. So you get a couple Bromley tees, you get a fanny pack. You guys are made in the shade. So that's my shameless pitch right now. I'm gonna pull this bad boy up and we're gonna get rolling. That's enough shilling for today. My first impression of Joel in this is that he comes off well spoken. I can see how people respond to him well in person, people that know him or train under him. He seems knowledgeable. He obviously has an education. When you start to leak into the jargon a little too much, and it's a little bit different when you're talking to other industry heads, but when you do that a little too much and you're framing it in a way where you're able to speak in these like very kind of absolute matter of fact terms, it's very easy for things to get muddied because it just takes that extra step to interpret what he's saying. First of all, the types of things he's saying, I think, are unnecessarily complex. I mean, he's talking about co-contraction and motor unit recruitment. It seems like he goes out of his way to use jargon, which always triggers me a little bit because most of the people watching this aren't going to immediately register. I always think that somebody has an angle when they're trying to lean on it because meaning is just muddied that much more easily. He's also stating things in a very matter-of-fact way, like, well, this is optimal for motor unit recruitment. Well, in what context? I mean, the guy in the beginning hit the nail on the head. He's like, I get the sense that there's nuance to this. Maybe it reduces to some absolutist reductionist principle, but there's probably nuance. So to state matter-of-factly, and then to say the thing that you guys that triggers me, gets my blood pressure through the roof, is when people say, well, there's science to show this, because that is such a lazy, generalized term. It's something that doesn't require having to get into the science. And by science, we mean studies. And by studies, we mean experiments that are limited in the types of questions they can ask, in the amount and type of people that they are used with. And they're extremely limited on what we can pull out of them, especially in exercise science, probably more so than any other scientific discipline. There is a sincere limitation to what you can pull out of it. So I take exception when someone's like, well, there's science to support this. And that ultimately means you filtered through a couple of studies, you took your liberties interpreting them and used it to nail it to this overly broad way of looking at the world where this is the way to do it. And you have to ask yourself, okay, in real terms, is this better developmentally? Do I know that because it's just so blatantly obvious? Or is there something else at stake where I need to have this in-group dynamic in order to sell, in order to have my loyal followers?
I work with some pretty significant athletes as well. Not gonna like mention names, but folks that are at the highest level. And so it's a really interesting question for me of what is the appropriate amount of stimulus from a weight room and what are the appropriate ranges of motion that are necessary. And I think the ultimate question, I think it's almost like maybe it's a purely mechanical, objective, scientific, reductionist, absolute answer exists in here somewhere, but it seems like there's nuance and probably a lot of variables in the question. But what's the most effective style of training in the weight room that transfers the best over to the field or the ice for an athlete? Can you explain like your perspective on that?
Yep. So one of the things that I always try to differentiate as much as I can is sports performance, and then the other kind of side category of Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting in their own separate category, as their own unique entity, if you will, because obviously for those competitions and for those endeavors, you need to be able to get into deep positions and you need to be able to, basically lift heavy in those positions. And so I always say the 90-degree principle applies predominantly to other athletes in other sports that don't involve, being judged when it comes to lifting weights. So now with that said, I don't agree that, or I don't say that powerlifters and Olympic lifters would not benefit from 90 degrees. I actually do believe they would benefit greatly from including a good amount of 90-degree training in their protocol, simply because I believe, and again, there's science to substantiate this, that with 90-degree joint angles, you do optimize not just your biomechanical leverage and anatomical levers, but also motor unit recruitment. You also maximize the element of co-contraction between agonist and antagonist muscles, which is really important for joint stability on and off the field. But particularly when we're talking about, non-contact injuries, which is becoming more and more prevalent in sports. And so, that's what I try to do with my athletes. I try to say, hey, how are we going to most closely mimic what's happening on the field? Now, obviously, athletes are going to end up in bad positions. It's not like, you're only playing the sport to 90 degrees and that's it. That's not practical. And in fact, every one of the athletes that I train, I can guarantee you every time they go onto the playing field, they're getting into positions periodically that are not always 90 degrees. I'm sure they're getting into extreme positions here and there. So that's going to happen. But when we look at kind of like what's optimal biomechanics for sprinting, for hitting, for throwing, for running, we can see from the science that 90 degrees is biomechanically optimal for most positions. And the nervous system is very pliable. So what I like to do is say, hey, how we train is going to transfer to the field. And I think most strength coaches would agree with that. So if we train to optimize the biomechanics and the nervous system to operate on those 90-degree positions, it's more likely that we're going to end up in those optimal biomechanical states when we're on the playing field, and therefore we're going to be producing more force and having a reduced chance of injury. But like I said, I also understand that it's going to happen periodically. Every time someone goes in the field, that they're going to be in compromised positions. But I already spoke a lot there. Let me hand that over to you guys a little bit.
So a lot of repeating the same terminology, nothing really answering why it's optimal. It's asserting that it's optimal. It's saying that there's science, again, interpretation of individual studies to suggest that it's optimal. And it seems like it's a lot of speaking in circles. And this is, God, if you guys go back and watch that Israel debate, it was just so obvious that Mike was like a master in the field and Joel was just kind of winging it because he's used to getting away with this type of really vapid bullshit when he's talking to other people, because the people he deals with don't know better. Like, elite athletes don't know better. That's why, honestly, it's why we don't tend to listen to the elite athletes, because most of them, I mean, you need this element of talent to get to where you are, and it can be exploited by strength and conditioning coaches. So when you're looking at what works for a group of people who not only are not being judged directly by how good their lifts are, but they're pre-selected for how they respond to training, that gives you like the worst idea as far as what is effective, what is going to be the most effective as far as these protocols go, because there's more right answers for them. Let's put our heads down. Let's trudge through.
So, what do you think on that?
So you first brought up Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting, and I understand that. Is your position that like really those ranges of motions, like that's a separate thing? Like you guys can squat below 90, you can bench below 90, or sorry, above 90. I don't know.
Yeah, it's how you, because full biomechanics.
Right. Full range in powerlifting, full range in Olympic lifting. That's totally fine. But you were saying sport specific, like you shouldn't do that.
I don't recommend it under heavy loads.
Okay.
What is, so do you have to define, can you define heavy load? Because this is where it gets, from my perspective, into nuance and specificity of well, who is the person? What is a heavy load? Is there some people that could do maybe a light load? At what point does that subjective concept of heavy load become heavy load?
I don't really do any loaded exercises beyond 90 degrees. Okay. And I can explain that a little bit more in a second here. But if I have other strength coaches that say, hey, Joel, I like your 90-degree centric isometrics method, but I also like including, some large range of motion or some end range, how do you feel about that? I'm like, hey, whatever's worked for you, as long as you've done the research and as long as you've kind of understood the methods and aren't just blindly implementing them and you understand what you're doing with that. But I always say, hey, I just don't recommend doing heavy loads under those larger positions. I never say, hey, I still wouldn't do that. Now I say, hey, this is maybe what I do. I don't necessarily train any loaded positions under 90, but as long as you don't go heavy past 90, you'll probably be all right. Personally, I think it creates a little bit of a neuromuscular / neurological confusion, where if I want the athlete to end up in the best positions in their sport and to have the best biomechanics, that you're kind of confusing the nervous system and you're
Okay, literally just said the nervous system's plastic before that. This idea of confusion is something that I really don't get. It's like if you learn a new language, you're going to forget the old one. The idea that athletes, the most kinesthetic people in the world, like you're going to throw off their positioning by having them do an exercise. So the question is like, what does all of the other shit he has them do? How does that not create confusion? Because he literally refers to it as chaos training. So that's a really, really bizarre claim right there, that it's going to create confusion. And then there's also this element of specificity, which I'm going to get to because they're going to talk about it more, where he wants people to mimic the position they're in on the field, which is not what strength training is for. Strength training is a developmental protocol. So I find that to be dog shit as well. And again, it's like you can fixate on the minutia, you can fixate on the studies, you can get yourself just wrapped up in the jargon. But to miss such obviously big things as that, like the fundamental difference between a developmental stressor, like increasing, like lifting to increase your ability to produce force generally, and things that actually prepare you specifically for the sport, that teach you how to apply that to your sport, those are different things. So to try and cost somebody a developmental effect on one end because you're trying to like pull from that thing and marry it over here and make it a little more field specific is really, I mean, that's just a bizarre premise on the face of it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't any validity to what he's saying. It's just that the premise itself seems completely flawed. And also notice, if you haven't already, he's not defining what heavy means. He keeps saying heavy. The host of the show was right in saying this is where things get tricky because we throw around these terminologies without holding ourselves accountable to be specific, and then we just end up speaking over each other's head. Heavy can mean something that's high effort. Heavy can mean something that's heavy for you. Oftentimes people use heavy in a general sense, like when I did a video on like strongmen, like comparing I don't know, strength of like the different weight classes, they always come into the comments and say like, oh, lifting heavy like this is going to like tear you up long term or something. And it's like, well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean pushing the limits for what you can handle? Or do you mean objectively like the wear of 800 pounds on a regular basis? Those are entirely different things. So unless you can specify what you mean by heavy, is it effort? Is it absolute load? Is it relative load? Is it specific to what you can do? And having already conceded, hey, athletes get in bad positions. Well, the only way you insulate yourself to being in those bad positions is through some loading. So does that mean any loading whatsoever is going to be so injurious that it's not worth being more resilient in those positions? I mean, there's more questions that pop up from this than not.
Enforcing what I would consider to be less than optimal motor programs in their central nervous system. So that's why I don't do it. Now, I used to. Okay, and this has been kind of my journey on the whole 90-degree thing, is that I actually come from a background where I squatted ass to grass and taught ass to grass. And then I started to see a little bit more value in changing some of the range of motion, but I still included large range because it's like, hey, I still want that mobility and whatnot. And over the years, I would say I've become a little bit more, again, if you want to call it absolute, not because I've just become more stubborn and stuck in my ways, but just because of what I've seen works best with my athletes. So
the issue that I found as a strength and conditioning coach is consistently it's a loading problem. So like most of what we do is loading. If somebody thinks that a deadlift is bad for them, or full range deadlift or whatever is bad for them, well, what does that mean? If I put a 20 kilo barbell in your hand, are you going to be able to hinge at the hips and deadlift it? Well, the answer is yes. The next answer would be, well, in 4 weeks, it's likely that I could get you to do 100 pounds. And then in 8 weeks, it's likely that I could get you to do, X amount of pounds. And so when the way that I see loading and heavy load and load is that it's all subjective to the person's training. So it's really hard to then say, hey, ass to grass squats are bad for you at heavy loads, because heavy loads is not a direct line. But there's one part, Joel, that I think that I mainly kind of disagree with you in, is that it's that kind of using specificity as this idea that you can continuously defend your point using specificity, because it's really hard to know then at what line we should do things in the weight room. Because the weight room isn't specific. If we wanted to be specific with basketball players, we'd have them shoot weighted basketballs,
take them to church,
attach bands to their hips and have them jump around, which people do. But the reason why we have people in the weight room is to get general physical preparedness. And so if we look at general physical preparedness, well, it's not specific to the game. It's not. And then you as a coach have to determine where and when you implement non-specific things to specific training. So to say that ass to grass squatting is never viable ever, well, then what comes with that is a lot of other things are not viable, or they have to be, or they should be. It's what happens is, Joel, is like you kind of lay out this line, and then now we can ask questions and determine all of the things underneath that line. Like, hey, is this wrong? Is this wrong? Is this wrong? And you go, well, maybe not, maybe not. And my thing is, if you never put the line there will never be the issue. And that's where, like, continuously in your verbiage, in your posts, we see the line being drawn. And that's ultimately my issue with the content that you've posted over the years.
But
there's an arbitrariness to where he decides to put the line, because if you're asking what is the most specific type of training protocol you can use for an athlete, let's say it's 90 degrees, and there's been a debate about this for actually a very long time. There was a movement, and I think they still do it, where they don't have sprinters squat ass to grass, where they have them do like quarter squats, heavy overloaded, because that's the position they're in off the blocks. That's where they need the most force production. And it gets into a heated argument. It goes back to the difference between training for generic meathead goals or specific athletic goals. I don't have a clear-cut line on that. I don't know that it's obviously better to have sprinter squat ass to grass, because it goes back to what kind of development do you need? Do you need the glutes of a pro bodybuilder? Do you need Tom Platt's legs? We know that like, okay, generally in these sports, like being stronger is better than being weaker, but is there value in going from, let's say, a 300 to a 500 squat? Is there value from going to 500 to 600? How strong do you need to be to do all these things? And how do you need it in that particular position versus in kind of a general sense? I mean, strength training in general, increasing force production, that's what we want. And you do that on firm grounding. You do that in a very stable way. And the more you do to challenge that, you're getting taken away from that end goal. So when Seedman says, hey, I want 90 degrees because that's closer to how we perform in the field, it's like, okay, well, now let's look at literally everything else you do. And in what ways can we identify that it's not specific to being on the field? Well, of course, there's going to be just like endless ways that they're not specific. So what evidence do you have? And this is what it's going to come down to. Are you developing people better? And are you sparing them from unnecessary injury? And this is the thing he's going to allude to, but he's never going to actually come out and say.
Philosophy goes past that. It goes beyond that, because actually the way I train most of my athletes, whether it's a golfer, a baseball player, a football player, general populations, 70-year-old, it's actually pretty similar. Okay. I actually focus and stick to squatting, hinging, lunging, horizontal push and pull, vertical push and pull with 90 degrees. And I have a golfer right now, a PGA golfer. I don't know if I posted a few things. So I don't know if I'm not going to give his name out, but if people want to go to my page, I haven't got his permission. I can give his name, but I just trained him today. And we were discussing, and he understands this. Like, I'm not training him like a golfer. I'm training him to get his body moving correctly. And I believe that the 90-degree positions are not just the most optimal in terms of recruiting highest number of motor units, creating those co-contraction positions when we need them to stabilize joints, but it's also the healthiest on the tissues. It minimizes how much we have to recover and how much we kind of beat the body up. It minimizes tension to the joints and the connective tissue. And as a result, we've been training for like 3 weeks now, and he already says, hey, I feel better. I feel like I can rotate and move better. We haven't touched rotational training. I don't know how much rotational training I'm even going to touch him, because he does so much rotation to begin with. So I'm not trying to like, oh man, he's a golfer, I'm going to train him totally different. I just go back to the foundational movements and nothing fancy yet. Eventually we'll get to a few cool stabilization, probably hanging band exercises, which I'm a fan of, and some offset work, because I believe there's some good and important neurological things that creates in the nervous system. But it's pretty basic. If people come and watch me and they shadow me, they see it's like, man, it's pretty simple. You train a lot of guys the same way, regardless of their goals, and they get that because they feel the benefits of that. So I don't want to.
Now, that's the biggest issue I take with Joel. Zach's definitely brought it up before, and I'm a little bummed that this entire focus was really about the 90-degree squat thing, because this is, I think, where Joel looks the best. I think this is where he comes off the best compared to everything. And a lot of people are going to hate that, but when you look at what is required to get an athlete good, all those questions I brought up before are relevant. So as you get further and further and further away from what a bodybuilder and a lifter has to worry about, which is this stress going to make me stronger? Is my squatting going to help me squat more? Is this exercise going to grow my legs? As you get further from that, and you deal with all the individual genetic variation, you look at the fact that they're not being judged specifically on their ability to lift weights. You look at it as a means to an end. You look at how the same thing generally gets prescribed to all the athletes, but the whole team has to get better. That represents so much noise from point A to point B that it really eliminates the need, let alone your ability, to be really surgical in your predictions and how this is going to affect a person. Because to get beyond that, you have to get down to the point of individual predictability of what we can do for this athlete specifically to have him be the best person he can be. And that's something that we have no predictive ability over individuals. At some point in the future, we'll be able to put genomes in a quantum computer, run billions of simulations about what ifs to see how their body responds at a chemical level, at a molecular level, and you'll be able to pull a bunch of information from that. That might happen in our lifetimes, probably not. By then, you're going to have things like gene editing being run of the mill. You're going to have, I don't know, fucking cloning. We're going to have like super babies like in Gattaca. We're going to have like attachments on our bodies like robot arms and shit. It's going to be fucking obsolete by that point. So in the meantime, we have to deal with this weird middle ground that exercise science is in, where it's just enough information that people like Joel can pull from it and make conclusions that the evidence doesn't support, and that we have to deal with that while not really being good enough to actually tell us exactly how we're supposed to train. And it's endlessly infuriating. But he says in this comment, people that follow me know that I trained the same way. That's been one of his defenses for a long time, since Zach's been poking at him, since other people have been making him a meme. And like I showed you, let's go on back. Let's go on back to the page of Joel Seedman. Look at all these Occasionally, he demonstrates a 90-degree squat. Occasionally. Oh, hey. Ooh, dude, do not blow out your ACL. But mostly, it's this weirdo offset shit, doing weird movements. I haven't been in here in a while. Some of these are new. Actually, I just want to kind of scroll down and see what he's been up to. What have you been up to, Joel? That's actually pretty tame. The single leg kickback thing is pretty common. But this is how he sells his books. So this is his branding through and through. This is the gimmick. Damn, she's getting jacked. He's been training her for a while. She's jacked. Can't even deny it. But this is his branding. So it's a cop-out to have this be 100% of the content that you push and then say, oh, no, but actually my training is very consistent. I rely on the basics. This is all the bells and whistles. It's dishonest at worst. And that's why I wish this debate would have been more thorough in calling him out on that, because the things you can get him on that. You can get him on his misunderstanding of specificity and getting things to transfer over to the field of sport. You can get him on his overrepresentation. Zach's going to bring some of this stuff up, but you can get him on the overrepresentation of what he believes to be true based on nothing other than he says the science says. So there's a lot to get him on. This is where he actually has the most grounding, because there is room. God, I had a buddy, Joe Buckley. I interviewed him a while ago. I got to see if that interview's still up. Good friend of mine, strength and conditioning coach at the University of Redlands. He could have been a pro strongman, a pro middleweight if he kept doing it. But he ended up moving to Idaho with his wife to have kids. And I don't know, what do they do in Idaho? Grow potatoes? Buckley's out there growing potatoes in Idaho. So he would tell me about the fuckery that would go on at these strength and conditioning like seminars. And you would just get people out of the woodwork selling the most ridiculous shit. And when you think about why they're able to do that, why there can be so much variation, so many people trying to push the envelopes, they obviously have an incentive to do it because you have to stand out. You can't do what everybody else was taught to do. You have to sell yourself. But the area between what you can change and what still provides a good result, all you need to be an effective strength and conditioning coach, your athletes have to generally get better and they have to not get injured. And if you can do that, you're made in the shade. And again, with the most elite athletes, the ones that respond the best, the ones that were pre-selected, you're going to get that. If you're a lifting coach, it's different, because now how you have them lift determines how they place. But that's not true with volleyball. It's not true with baseball. You just need to generally get them stronger, make sure they don't get fucked up. So that's the superpower these guys have, is to play around in that like weird middle ground.
Make it sound like, oh man, this is how they end up in the field, so I'm going to train them exactly like this. It's
no, and I don't think you're doing just that. It's just when you use specificity as the reason for why we don't do deep squats. So right. that's where it's like, okay, well, hold on, because the specificity thing is a weird one, right? Like we do GPP, like Verkoshansky and all of the Russians back in the 60s and 70s, like they're like, hey, we can train people not specific to their sport. Because if like what they used to do is just be like, oh, you're a javelin thrower, just go throw the javelin. Maybe throw like a heavier one, maybe do some different drills. But now we realize like we can do things to help you be more explosive of a human. But we all know these things. And now we know that like we don't have to train our athletes completely specific. And I know you know that as well. But what even in your response just now, you're like, this I feel is the healthiest and most optimal. It's most optimal, healthiest, most optimal. Those are both superlatives. Those are both absolutes. And I think, again, that's fine from a strength and conditioning coach, because we all have our biases from what works. Like this has worked for me. Has worked. It's just that, again, the way that you formulate some of your posts, it seems as though it's not really, it doesn't bring that nuance that I would like. I have some posts here of yours. If you were comfortable, if I could bring them up and
totally.
Okay. So this one's actually
it might have been my twin brother that said these things though.
Who's your twin, Joe? Joe Seedman?
That's exactly right.
Okay, so this one's from 4 years ago, Joel. Okay. Yeah. This one says stop squatting ATG. Let's see here. If your training goals are decreased strength, increased joint pain, degradations to natural body mechanics, herniated discs, sciatic issues, chronic low back pain, blown knees, foot.
Zach cuts out a bit here. I'm just going to read it. If your training goals are decreased strength, increased joint pain, degradations to natural body mechanics, herniated discs, sciatic issues, chronic low back pain, blown out knees. God, this is like the list of side effects for an antidepressant commercial. Jesus. foot and ankle aberrations, decreased jump performance, decreased jump. Hey guys, don't squat deep. Your jump will get worse. Degraded gait mechanics, constant muscle. It keeps going, but like this is what, and this is perfect. This is what you pin Joel on. This is the absolutist bullshit that he pushes that is really good at getting people to buy into it. He just sat there and he thought, how many broad things can I attribute using an immense amount of hyperbole to this thing that I'm trying to push people against to set myself apart? That's entirely what this is. I mean, you get the point across 3 or 4 things in, but he's reaching. Foot and ankle Have you guys that squat ass to grass, have you ever come across somebody with foot and ankle aberrations? Actually, just the opposite. I've worked with a ton of athletes. If you ever played football in high school and college, if you knew who the athletes were, you know that some of the most springiest, strongest guys get bound up like fucking crazy to the point where they can't get their knee over their toe, which actually reduces your ability to generate force. If you ever watch anything with knee over toe guy, what does he do? He gets the mobility throughout the ankle so you can get that knee forward and then build strength in the knee so you can actually handle those forces. That's how you fix your knee, and that's how you increase ability. I mean, the further you get your knee forward, the more force you can generate from your knee, full stop. That's just the way it goes. So these absolutist statements, I mean, he doesn't have anything specifically backing up these statements. He can just speak in a very broad sense, and it pushes everybody his way. There is no incentive for Joel to have a very measured take on the degree to which full squatting degrades natural body mechanics. Like, what could you possibly look to that supports that? Herniated discs, you're telling me loading, because remember, you're stronger in a partial range of motion. So somebody doing half squats is going to get very strong very fast. The loads they're going to be handling are going to be much, much heavier than if they were going full ass to grass is a load limiting exercise. The weight has to be lower. So you're telling me herniated discs happen less often when you're loading the weight up and doing a half squat? I come from a strongman background. I can tell you that that's some bullshit, that the heavy overloaded yoke picks, everything's like 13-inch, 18-inch range of motion from the ground. Yeah, I don't know about that, bud. But I don't know. Zach seems on the warpath. I'm hoping he pulls out the fatality pretty soon. God, there's my dated references.
Foot and ankle aberrations, decreased jump performance, graded gait mechanics, constant muscle tightness, and the need to continually. So that statement right there doesn't really bring much nuance at all. Like you're presenting one option, saying you can do this, and then saying how bad it is. Yeah. So Joel, I would just love to hear your thoughts on that post. Do you remember that post, or?
I must have been drunk. I don't remember. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, 100% I remember that. Okay, that's probably the most honest and open I've been about my overall feeling. And again, people are probably like, "What? You kidding me? You actually believe that?" I do believe that. Most of the time, I'm not that. Yes, most of the time, I'm not that honest and upfront and bold because I know most of the time people can't handle that. And I saw at that post people couldn't handle it quite as much as I was hoping they.
This is some bizarre. I mean, at this point, I wish I was like an FBI profiler because like the body language, like somebody could have a field day with this. He's putting the hands up, he's pumping the brakes, but he's trying to pivot. He's being honest, right? So that's the virtue there. It's not that what he's saying is getting people's feathers ruffled because it's not correct, or because he went like way too far because a very complex subject that requires nuance. He just went way over the line. That's not why. No. It's because people can't handle honesty. And it's like, I spare them. Most of the time I'm not this honest. I spare them because they can't handle the honesty. This is just trying to reorient himself as somebody who knows more than you, somebody who has insight into something that you don't understand. And he has to be gentle with how he spoon feeds it to you because he doesn't want like your brain to break under the weight of this truth. Like full squats cause a degradation of gait mechanics. So, hey, what a guy. I mean, we don't deserve Joel Seedman.
Would, and I knew it was going to spark some controversy. I didn't think it was going to be that confrontational because to me, hey, everyone's got an opinion. So it's like, you believe that, I don't believe it, but so on, do your own thing. So that was, I 100% stand by those words. Am I being a little melodramatic for the sake of kind of like, presenting it to get people's attention? Possibly, but I've seen all those things occur in my own body as well as my own athletes. Now, The key is that it doesn't happen immediately, because it's like somebody says, hey man, I'm squatting deep, I didn't blow my knees out. Well, I can go show you a deep squat right now and I won't blow my knees out either. But it's over time. And I always say poor body mechanics, okay? It's like smoking. It might take weeks, it might take months, it might take years. For some folks who genetically are blessed, whatever, it may take decades, but eventually smoking catches up to everyone, just like poor body mechanics catch up to everyone. I've worked with enough athletes who've been training for years and decades that when they have a what I would consider some form of muscle dysfunction, I'm not gonna go into whether I would say the 90 thing is dysfunctional right now, but it's my feeling and belief, and my again, the science, in my opinion, when I look at that and from comparing that to what I see on the field, that when we train with poor body mechanics, okay, it transfers to the field. And so when I see someone squat ass to grass, go ahead.
You see the playing both sides, and he's really good at being agreeable, actually. And this is something I have a special bone to pick with lifting culture in general, is that I believe it is too agreeable. And I feel this too. We're all guilty of it because we're all in this weird niche together. And you can talk endless shit about somebody when you're removed from them and they're just a public figure, and you can throw tomatoes at them from across the internet. But when you meet them in person, the tone can change. Your ears lower a little bit. You're a little more receptive to hearing them through usually. And that's something that doesn't get challenged enough. You think all these people like testosterone levels through the roof, all kinds of like androgens making them irritable. It's like they're balding and they're broken out in acne and they're like super roid raging. You would think that you'd watch like Dave Tate's Table Talk and just see people going at it. But you actually don't get that. You get a lot of kind of tiptoeing a little bit. This is pretty good. I mean, they're saying what their grievances are. It's not hostile. It doesn't need to be hostile. But there definitely has to be a more effort in overcoming this defense, because Joel's defense works. I mean, if you can see through it or not, it works. It's putting the hands of being like, hey, I'm just being honest, guys. I'm an agreeable guy. Listen to me. I sound smart. I know what I'm talking about. I'm not trying to, step on anybody's sacred cows, but he's playing both sides of the field. He's being absolute as fuck, just like he didn't know it was going to stir controversy. Get out of here. That's the point of every single post that he puts up. That's his entire brand. But he's also trying to say he's appealing to the science while saying it's his opinion and everybody has their own way. Like, hold those two statements in your head. Like, realize that that's his premise. The science shows it's infallible. It's objective. I'm appealing to the objective research that's been done that's established this as fact. But this is my opinion of the science. Everybody does their own thing. Like, I wouldn't do it that way, but hey, as long as you research and it works for you, bud, whatever. Well, which is it? Is there playing the joints? Is it whatever feels good, man? Or is it just follow the science, and it has to be objective and we can actually determine what truth is? It's a bizarre point in time we're in. It's like we keep toggling back and forth to like pre and post enlightenment. I don't know. Let's see what Zach says.
Right.
So you mentioned poor body mechanics, but like, right. What if it's not poor?
Yeah, that's the nuance part.
I would consider an
always poor
ass to grass squat poor body mechanics for most sports, because that's not weightlifting and powerlifting.
Okay. Well, so that doesn't count. I don't want to even. Those aren't even in my realm of
right.
Like, so with my grapplers, we would squat below parallel, and we would actually relatively light. And the most we'd ever do was like body weight, and I wouldn't let their knees collapse, and I wouldn't let them do a lot of things. This is me. I'm a coach. I'm watching you. Hey, if they do a shitty rep, I go, hey, that was shit. That's what a coach is supposed to do. I don't eliminate the movement entirely. But Joel, this is an important thing, because we can kind of move on from here. If you believe that there is no way that movement can be proper, then we can actually genuinely disagree and move on from this point.
It becomes very circular, kind of like biblical conversation.
Yeah. No, this is like you said, this is kind of like, we're picking at one point, but it's also kind of the central point of this entire argument. So it's like we figure this out and you kind of show everything. So I think this is important. There is one other thing that I didn't mention. I've mentioned it before in post. I do believe an ass to grass bodyweight squat is perfectly healthy. I have no issues with that for anyone and everyone who can do it pain-free. Okay. Because there are some people just structurally who that's not in their wheelhouse for whatever reason anatomically.
The air squat or body weight squat is actually a loaded squat. And here's why. Like,
Right.
if we talk about metabolites in the muscle forming after 20 reps of an air squat, all of a sudden the mechanical load on your joints and your tissues is actually higher than if you just did one single rep. So, you can have bad biomechanics on your 21st rep, whereas your first rep is good. And the reason why this is important is because there is still a load variable between person to person, between rep to rep, between set to set. So again, if your rule is that, okay, we only are allowed to do body weight squats below parallel, well, that still is subjective. And somebody who weighs 285 pounds is going to have much more load on their joints and their, all of their systems are going to have much more load than somebody who's 150 pounds.
This goes back to what I was saying earlier. I don't consider a heavy force production 90-degree squat, like a squat we would use for jumping, okay? I don't consider that and a body weight or an ass to grass squat the same motor programs. I feel like they, and I do believe they are two very different and distinct motor programs that it's not.
Let's take a second. Like, this has always bothered me. It looks like he has one of those like genetic deformities where his face and his head are too small for his body. These are like borderline like 90s action figure proportions. Like, this kind of looks like my Cyclops action figure from like 1996. And his face is all washed out. I'm like, this is a normal looking guy. I've always looked at this and I'm like, I don't know. That has nothing to do with anything. I'm just staring at this with like utter contempt. Going back to what Joel said, again, notice how terms are not being defined. They're being used very liberally, but they're not being defined at all. So heavy, we didn't get a definition for what heavy was. Poor mechanics, what does that mean? You might have intuited, and Zach and the host intuited, that means like some positional error, knees coming in, ankle or arch collapsing, something like that. That's a rational intuition. Joel is kind of sneakily saying, well, anything that's below 90 degrees is poor mechanics. And it's this like circular thing where it's like he's trying to use his premise that the mechanics, that this isn't the way to squat, to like insert as the definition of why you shouldn't squat to 90 degrees. It's like, or shouldn't squat past 90 degrees. The whole thing is like utter bullshit, but he won't define what the terms are. And that's what makes all of this, I mean, fundamentally ascientific. There is no science in any of this. When you're at this point where you're stretching definitions this far, or going out of your way not to like put your line in the sand exactly what it is that you're talking about, there is no science has left the chat. There's no science to be talked about at this point.
Not like they're going to really interfere with each other, because again, it goes back to that spinal flexion thing. It's not like we're trying, I don't coach people to keep that spine super neutral and arched when they get into that deep position. If they did, it's like, okay, this is starting to get closer to the positions you might want to like jump out of. You're getting your body braced. So I use the ass to grass squat in theory and philosophy as like, hey, this is just more of a chilling position. This is not a position I'm going to have you producing lots of force and doing lots of concentric, eccentric cycles of movement. If you want to hang out there for a few minutes and just chill, totally fine. But we're not going to do sets and reps of that. So that's not something I ever do with my athletes. It's like, hey, if you want to get into a squat position, just kind of hold that and just kind of relax like people would in third world country squat, go for it.
Is there a certain body mass index of a person that suddenly you would not advise a deep squat with, because suddenly they're loaded too much? If I'm a 350 pound lineman in the NFL, am I too loaded for that to be an advantageous position to create, specific adaptation and post demand, like to create some more robusticity around my knees and my ankles and get some expansion contraction muscles around my pelvic floor and kind of support some of that circulation of all those fluids through that just natural compression that would manifest as a product of going through that range of motion? If I'm 350 pounds, is that too heavy? What if I lose 50 pounds? What if I was 200 pounds? Then I went on a 6-month bender and I gained 100 pounds. Is it suddenly not safe for that position anymore? What if I wear a weight vest? It's like, now it's almost like it's my body weight. What if I wear a 100-pound weight vest? What if I'm maintaining perfect joint mechanics, perfect joint centration, all the way from, toes all the way up to my fingertips, and pressure dynamics, like everything is really like just brick shit how strong. I just, for me, it would be really hard to move me away from the perspective that there's a lot of nuance.
I would just like to kind of fundamentally grab what you're all about, Joel. It seems as though there is no solid foundation of good biomechanics that can come from repetitions of ATG squats. Is that a correct assumption to make? Can I make that assumption?
Definitely.
Okay. So then I would say then we can agree to disagree there. Like seriously, genuinely.
Yeah. We all believe that our approach is best. Otherwise, if it wasn't, I would be using somebody else's approach. If I believe Mark Bell's approach was the best, I would be exclusively using. So everybody thinks.
Look how excited he is right now. That's what he wanted to hear. He wanted to get to that point because now he can rely on this. He just, in his mind, he was just like, oh. And this is where, and I don't think Zach did a bad job here. Zach pushes him. He presents questions. He calls him out on some stuff. And I don't think you necessarily need to be a pit bull and like go for the jugular. But once you're at the point where you can be like, we agree to disagree, there, I feel like there was a lot more you could have pushed. And the casual conversation of, like I was talking about the agreeableness, like the conversations that go on between people who are in the field together, and there's a basic camaraderie and not wanting to go too hard with the other person. That's where somebody like Joel thrives. Because Zach and the host, I thought strategically, in where it looked like they were pressing him, it was almost like they were on his side of the court. Because it's almost like you're playing with his premise and saying, well, but what if you have a heavier body weight? What if you have a weight vest? They're doing all these like what ifs, trying to incrementally inch him back to the middle. And I think you could have really just started the whole thing and said, like, what evidence do you have to support what you're saying? I mean, you could have given much broader hypotheticals that were so much further away from where he was that I don't think that incremental approach on his side of the field was really all that powerful. And I think he felt it, that the heat was kind of dissipating. I think he felt this coming. But I think there's there were a lot more fingernails to pull off. All right. There were a lot more spikes to screw into his feet.
Because everyone's their own strength coach. Everyone has their own method. Nobody is 100% of the time copying another.
Everybody does their own thing, man. It's like, you can't fault me. I'm just doing this is how I interpret the science. You can't argue with the science. Science is science, but this is how I interpret the science. So it's like, I'm made in the shade, bro.
Strength coaches method verbatim perfectly. They're always taking a mix and match. So again, if I believe my way is the best way, okay, then there's like scales under that where I would say, doing tons of heavy, extreme loaded ass-to-grass, deep range of motion, consistently with heavy loads, hey, that's going to be problematic, and we can kind of work our way up until there's less issues. So we agree to disagree, but at the same time, I don't think what you're doing is going to be very problematic. I think it's a smarter approach.
So fundamentally, this is what my channel has been about. So weightlifting in the sports performance world has been under attack by just numbers of coaches. And it's usually the same argument over and over again. Why would I do a power clean when I can do a loaded jump or something that gets triple extension the way that these things happen? I believe that fundamentally the issue is actually within that coach and the self-awareness of the coach. What I feel happens a lot is the coach may not have a big background in Olympic weightlifting or teaching the Olympic lifts to a group of athletes. And they might see a frustration in this. And they might say, hey, I can get a lot of really good stuff out of the things that I implement. And I see great results. So what I'm going to do is write a blog post. That's how it started. Whether it was Elite FTS back in the day, whether it was T Nation, they write this op-ed about how shitty the Olympic lifts are for X, Y, and Z. And continuously, what I say is it's not the movement that is inherently bad or inherently suboptimal. It's just the coach's way of implementing it. And that is totally okay. I would say that I cannot implement these things as well as you can implement the things that you implement, Joel, unless I go to you and study under you for like a year or 2 years. And then I could be like, okay, now I'm going to implement it. But because I can't do that, because I'm not doing that, I am not going to implement Joel Seedman's stuff. And I think that you would say that's okay, right? That's a totally fine and acceptable thing. But what I don't want to do is say, hey, your shit is garbage. And there's one last example before I kind of send it over to you. Yeah. A big one of these was Robert Oberst on Rogan. And this video got 7 million views or something like that. I don't know. It's way in the millions. And he just said, you should not do deadlifts, period. Unless, unless you're getting paid or you're trying to be strong.
Oberst deadlift conspiracy.
You should not do deadlifts. It will injure you. To me, that is such an unacceptable, irresponsible thing to say to the population for a number of reasons. And it's that exact type of thing that proliferates. And sadly, Joel, that's what I see in some of your posts. And maybe you don't mean that, but that is genuinely the issue.
So that is, and I agree with him there. And this is where like I would be really, my beliefs would kind of overlap with like the barbell medicine guys when they do talk about things like fear-mongering or they do talk about catastrophizing and so on, that we're dealing with a population. Again, we do not have predictability over one person. That does not exist in any capacity. So what we have to do is take the entire population and try to say what's likely to exist and how does that work? How does that trade off with the negative things we're trying to avoid? How likely are those to exist? And an entire population, the general population is better off lifting, period. Like full stop, end of story. Whatever injuries, whatever bumps and bruises, like that is a true thing. So I can see the irritation with that. Also, the general population probably has the most to gain. I mean, if we're getting full out of the sports discussion of like what elite athletes should be doing to make themselves run faster and jump higher, if we're talking about the general population, absolutely should be squatting ass to grass, because again, they're not going to be handling the poundages that might pose the risk. And most lifters will recognize this. The people you know or you yourself, it's really hard to injure yourself when you're new. It's not impossible. I mean, anything's possible. I mean, people throw their backs out picking up a box, but you generally don't hear about substantial injuries when 85 pounds is on the bar. Once you get into the 2s, into the 3s, into the 4s, now it's like, okay, it's a matter of just when. You're going to get some tweak. You're going to get some strain. It's substantial enough. The people that have the most to gain from going to being able to bench press an empty bar to maybe 185, the people that are going to be sedentary and older, the people that are going to get diabetes, that are going to be bedridden by the time they're older, they all could strengthen their joints immensely by going through a full range of motion and getting the mobility and the bodily control. You need to be able to stand up from a deep position. And those are the people that need to hear this the most. As far as what Oberst said, I'm a little charitable to Oberst because I had a lot of injuries myself with deadlifting. I wouldn't say what he said. I think there's an approach to it if you are susceptible to issues. But Oberst is a perfect example of why you do not just listen to somebody because they're good. Oberst is a perfect example of a guy who's strong and doesn't really know why. I'm not calling Oberst dumb. Oberst is talented. That's a different type of handicap. All right. It's like a privilege and a disadvantage all at the same time. Oberst could never figure out his deadlift, but he didn't have that same barrier with his log press. He wouldn't have pressed what he did if he did. So, and that, I don't want to talk shit, but you talk to enough people around and people mirror or people will, discuss certain character traits, work ethics, so on, that certain people have. And it kind of makes their successes and failures a little more clear cut. But when you have that obstacle, you're like, if I try to deadlift the way that I try to bench, I can bench 600 pounds every week and I'm fine. I try to deadlift, 600 pounds every other week and I get injured. What the fuck? And it's frustrating. And it takes a little bit more insight to figure that out. But again, that calculation it's so wildly different depending on the lift. It's so wildly different depending on the goal. It's so wildly different depending on the individual, which is why the host keeps calling for nuance. And Joel continues to not give any.
That I have.
Sometimes it comes down to the mood too. Like the post from 4 years ago, I don't know. I just like, hey, I'm just going to let it all out. I'm like, hey, this is what I believe 100% and take it or leave it. Other times I'm going to post and it's like, hey, I'm going to have a little less controversy. This one maybe a little bit more subtle, kind of like, hey, here's some of the principles I use, but maybe these other approaches. Okay. So, I mean, again, I would say, yes, I agree that my views and philosophies are pretty absolute and pretty dogmatic, but at the same time, I value and appreciate what other coaches such as yourself are doing. So it's not like, oh man, what you're doing is horrible. Again, it's on a scale. So again, if I want to put mine at like a 9 and yours is maybe like, I don't know, 7, that again, I'm just from my own psychological mind of how I would view that. Whereas if I do someone, like I saw somebody the other day, somebody sent me a post, it was this guy's account and everything they were doing was like spastic movements. Like everything had to be rapid. Like even just picking the weight up off the floor, like it just had to be like super spastic because if movement, every movement has to be quick. Every movement has to be fast because we move fast as athletes. And you looked at the quality of movement. I was like, man, this is like, I would never say this on social media. I would never mention his name, but like on a scale of 1 to 10, I would put the quality of movement at like a 2.
So Joel, you now.
So that's interesting. We got a couple things. One is that apparently there is an amount of fuckery that Joel Seedman thinks is too far. And I'd be very interested to see like on a sheet, like if you could just make him fill out a chart where you just have like pros and cons and just say, what do you think this does well? Why do you think this is bad? If you could corner him into saying what features made it a 2 on your scale, you'd be hard pressed not to see just an arbitrary list of training preferences. And if his own mantra of like, well, this is my opinion of the science. And as long as you research, you don't know, hey, maybe that guy has his own interpretations. That's if you build a flimsy board for you to stand on, because that's the only way you can build anything at all, then that holds true for everybody else you're going to argue against. They get to stand on the same footing that you set for yourself.
Naturally spectrumed out what you believe is the best and what you believe is the worst. You created this spectrum, and then within that spectrum, depending on the person, it can change. And that's the sort of nuance that every single strength and conditioning coach has, and every successful one has. And I feel as though, like, I personally would love if you could do that in one of your posts. But the problem is, I feel as though it's going to be hard to sell your program and your methodology if you do that. And I understand that you have to make money. You have to, it's about your thing and what you do. At this point, I would like to press you just a little bit more here. I have one more example, and then I have an exciting proposition for you. Okay. So I have one more post that you have recently. In this post, you have an NFL player who's doing 90-degree eccentric isometric, and you're speaking over the top of it. And you say, deep HEG squats are responsible for more injuries than any other training method or exercise in existence.
Notice that Joel made that statement or made that post, but here when he's talking to Zach, he's like, well, I'd put yours at like a 7 out of 10. You know what you're doing. I think mine's better, but you're a smart dude. Like, your stuff is valid. You can't hold those standards at the same time. You can't say you're using literally the most injurious exercise in order to train your athletes, but also, it's pretty good though. 7 out of 10, brother. I mean, that's a C average. That's pretty good. Well, I don't know. It's good, but it's a passing score. It's bizarre how he's allowed to play both sides of the fence.
Contrast. 90-degree eccentric isometrics are the single most therapeutic modality, never contributing to any injury, but healing instead. So when I hear that, that is incredibly absolute, saying the most injurious of any methodology. And then that 90-degree squatting is the most healing of any methodology. If you could kind of explain that maybe in a little bit more depth, or what your thoughts were with that.
Yeah. So again, I do believe that's one of those, posters like, hey, I'm letting it all out. Like, this is how I feel. But actually, so if you look at the research of Olympic weightlifting, and this has been a kind of a known thing for quite a few, I guess say decades now, because when I did my USAW certification back in the day, which is getting close to like 16 years now, we talked about how the sport of Olympic weightlifting has a very low rate of injury. Right. I mean, it just does. Right. When you actually look at the statistics of what's been shown, and the same thing with powerlifting, like if you compare it to other sports, it's not all that different. It's pretty similar. It might be like either a tad higher or a tad lower, but it's relatively statistically similar for all intents and purposes. There was a recent, and it's maybe 1 or 2 studies, but they went back and reclassified the criteria that was going to be used to be categorizing injuries and what actually happened. Because as you know, weightlifters, powerlifters, they're pretty strong mentally and physically. If they're beat up and feeling sore, they're injured, they're going to try to train through it, right? I mean, it's just how it is. So they went back and reclassified what constituted as an injury. And they were very surprised to see this. This is actually in one of my articles online. Again, I try and put a ton of stuff online so people don't have to buy my programs unless they absolutely want to, but that's a different topic.
Do you know what the name is of this by chance?
It's like towards the end of my squat.
Okay.
I don't want to, yeah. It's the end of if you go towards the end of my squat 101 article, you'll see I think it's like the points 80 something to 101. It talks about like the truth about Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting studies, all that. Okay. Because I wanted to look at that more, because like, man, okay. So if Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting are not responsible for as many injuries as I thought, because it's like, all right, well then, but so they reclassified this notion of what constitutes an injury. When they did that, when they made it a little bit more.
Hold on, I want to get this chat. I stopped being able to take Tellender seriously when he went mad over Ripito saying a stronger guy is in general the easier it will be to get or be good in weightlifting. And that's a really interesting argument to get into, because it's not obvious, and it's one of the reasons. This goes back to like the Arthur Jones video I did a couple days ago, where I talked about the difference between a generalist and a specialist, where being a generalist is good. We all want to have a good generalized background, but there's things you don't know until you're in the shit. It's the way that like you could be involved in physical culture, but like most men are dog shit at guessing how good they're going to be in a fight. It's the oldest thing that happens, right? Until you actually get some like blue belt 145 pound dude like tie you up and you think, I bench press 400 pounds. It shouldn't be happening. Like, there's a lot of areas where you think you have enough skin in the game in order to make firm assessments. Ripeto's, I can't think of exactly what he said off the top of my head, but he's, I think, bitten off a bit more than he can chew in that field for a few reasons. And there are things about Olympic lifting specifically that are completely unintuitive. For instance, I came up looking at strongman, right? You have like the field where people come from all these other arenas, and you see it's like MMA. It's like, how strong are you really? You know, the powerlifters and the throwers, the football players, the wrestlers, and the Olympic lifters. And you have someone like Mikhail Kokolaev come through. And there were a couple guys from that background that came in just strong as shit. And I'm like, well, obviously he's explosive and he's limber and he squats ass to grass. He could jerk like close to 600 pounds. Like, this is going to be the guy. Like, he has all these athletic qualities. Like, he's going to run over it. Well, Kokolaev did pretty damn good, but he's also a freak specifically for Olympic lifting, because not only was he stronger than the other guys that set the records or got all the gold medals, his lifts did not do anything for him. Like, his best clean and jerk was like a 550. That's being able, and I don't know if he was this strong at the time, but through his career, I think he squatted and deadlifted 900 pounds. I'm pretty sure he squatted 900 pounds Olympic style in like a powerlifting meet. Strong motherfucker. You look at someone like Ilya Aline. Ilya Aline was like 198. He was competing in the 198s, I believe, and he was a teenager, and he clean and jerked in competition. It was like a 520 or something gross like that. It was over 500 pounds. Ilya Aline probably couldn't have squatted within 250 pounds of Kokolaev. And the same thing when you see Lasha. When you see Lasha throwing these weights around. I got into an argument with a guy over this the other day. Lasha, I don't believe Lasha is anywhere near a 400-pound strict press. Anywhere near. I know middleweight strongmen. There's not a lot of them, but I know a couple that can strict press 405 pounds. But those guys aren't clean and jerking 600 pounds. And Lasha doesn't need the 400-pound strict press to clean and jerk 600 pounds. So that's where it gets really weird. And again, this goes back to what degree does the thing you're trying to build actually help you with your goal? And it is not obvious. We rely on a lot of intuition. I wish there was some easy flow chart that I could draw about when it carries over and when it doesn't. Best we can do is look at the population of the best performers and say, what do they tend to do?
Strict. The rate of injury and the injury prevalence in powerlifting and weightlifting went through the roof. And I believe it was the squat, I'm almost positive because I had this in the article, was responsible for more injuries than deadlifts and bench press. And it was a pretty high number. So, and again, it doesn't mean that like, oh my gosh, they were incapacitated to the point where they were in the ER, they had to go to the doctor and they were bedridden. It's like, no, but they were feeling significant pain. They had a really...
Hold on, is he talking about Olympic lifters here? Or is he talking about...
More strict. The rate of injury and the injury prevalence in powerlifting and weightlifting went through the roof. And I believe it was the squat, I'm almost positive because I had this in the article, was responsible for more injuries than deadlifts and bench press. And it was...
Okay, guy, you got to specify what you're talking about, because Olympic lifting, like fucking 80+% of the training involves some type of squatting. Like, most of your training volume, if you're snatching, you're in a squat. If you're doing full cleans, you're in a squat. The accessory drills you do, I mean, you're actually squatting and front squatting separate from the clean and snatch. That's wildly different than a powerlifter. And especially powerlifting, this is what is insanely frustrating, because there isn't one thing that talks about powerlifting training. I mean, you're generally going to be using the same lifts, but how people prescribe it is wildly different. It's so different. You have an elite guy who might do a heavy touch once every 2 weeks. Optimizing recovery, they're so strong that every dose of stress with those weights, it's so big on the body, where if you have to pace those hard attempts far apart in order to recover. But then there's another problem where you also get, as you do that, so you recover, preparedness drops. So it's entirely possible strength goes up, preparedness drops, and then you end up getting an injury. You end up, even though you feel like everything's light, all your other tissues aren't up to snuff. There's also guys that do like submaximal work like multiple times throughout the week. Preparedness is high, but so is wear, so is fatigue. Then you get guys that train like fucking bodybuilders. Well, it's like, yeah, they squat. Maybe they're on some, I don't know, linearly periodized thing. But then most of their training is a bunch of other shit that's supposed to, how you parse out how prepared the athlete is, how much load they're handling, how much effort they're putting out. Their mechanics, powerlifters squat differently based on athletes are going to generally squat the same. You're going to generally look for most people, kind of an athletic squat, feet about shoulder width, usually aiming for depth. It's a little more comparable. Powerlifter, you could have guys with their toes 5 feet apart. You could have guys compacted in, trying to get as much compression. It's so different. And I'm going to have to look that study up. I'm really bothered he didn't specify.
It was pretty high number. So, and again, it doesn't mean that like, oh my gosh, they were incapacitated to the point where they were in the ER, they had to go to the doctor and they were bedridden. It's like, no, but they were feeling significant pain. They had to really alter their training methods because they were experiencing pain. And again, if we look at the research on inflammation and how muscles work, when you have any type of musculoskeletal inflammation like that, okay, that's long lasting, that literally accelerates the aging process. So it's like, man, this is like kind of traumatic on the body if people are doing this type of training. And we show the injury rate and prevalence is this high once we reclassify what an injury is.
But Joel, you immediately equated what I asked you to Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting, right? And that's not what I'm talking about.
So you have these categories of Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting. Those are the most extreme on that scale of like, wow, these are ultra loaded. And I think this was powerlifting they were looking at. It was either both or one or the other. But if you look at how a lot of strength coaches use ass-to-grass squats, how it's been used in the past and how it's still used, not all, because I mentioned the way you're using it to me is a much more intelligent approach. Okay, again, I wouldn't do it, but it's much more intelligent in my opinion. But the way you have a lot of these kids in high school and college, I see it daily. It's like, man, these new guys come in who have been in college and they're doing deep ass-to-grass squats with 500 pounds. It's like, okay, well, maybe they're not professional Olympic weightlifters and powerlifters, but for all intents and purposes, the amount of load that they're getting under these positions, it's like, man, this is pretty extreme. But powerlifters and go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
But don't you see how you're bridging that gap? Like that's what you're doing in your mind. You're the one bridging that gap, saying the moment we like you're calling ATG squatting the most injurious thing, the most injurious methodology, and you're bridging that gap to then saying that Olympic weightlifters, they may or may not get. I need to check this study out. They may or may not get the most injuries of most sports, and they increase the aging process, all of these things. And then you're bridging that gap to saying the strength coaches that you see are doing that, which may be true. But again, none of that is kind of founded in sort of this science. It's all kind of this feeling. But then the sentence that you produce is that it's the most injurious. I'm not sure that that's the most fair way of producing that.
So something in defense of the perspective of the concept of most, which doesn't really sound that absolute. All to me is absolute. Most actually seems like that's in the realm of conversations. Like that could be reasonable. That seems like there probably is
51%, right, Aaron?
Yeah,
that means
so
51% or more.
Exactly. So right. So that's but there probably is statistically some training modality or specific exercise, if there was some way to quantify it, that is the most injurious in all of athletic training or all of weightlifting. And so I'd be curious to like turn that around to you, Zach. If you had a gun to your head, which obviously you don't, and nobody really does, but if you had to take a stab at what is the most injurious exercise in strength and conditioning,
it's hard to kind of put something like I couldn't put a singular movement in that category, because to have something be the most injurious, that would envelop all loading, all sets and reps, all tempos, all eccentrics, all isometrics, all pauses into one singular movement, and then calling it and saying, this is injurious. I just simply cannot do that. Even the Instagram videos of the football players who are back squatting 500 pounds, like we don't know what the training was before that. And we don't know what the training was after that. Now, if we
that's just dead on right there. Like that's the only response you need. It's like you're trying to assign at the point where you can make that statement based off the information you have. It has to be so vague to be true that it's functionally useless. You can't use it for anything because it doesn't really say anything meaningful about anything. Because every time we insert something into a training program and you want to be able to make a comment about it, any variable, it could be the exercise, it could be the tempo, it could be the way you load, it could be your progression, could be the rep scheme, could be the RPE, could be anything that you can talk about in the context of a training program, does not exist in a vacuum. You cannot rate it unless you are rating it in the context of the environment that you are expressing it in. And that's where the ultimate shortfall, not just guys like Seedman, but actually exercise science as a whole, in the way that people like Seedman are allowed to pull so much out of it. If you are looking at a study, ask yourself immediately, well, what was the progression like? What exercise were used? What tempo was used? What was the standard for form? How do we equate form between people that are built differently? How do we deal with the individual with their different muscle fiber profile, with where their tendons insert, with their unique genetic variability? The fact is you just can't. So we use a bunch of people And we just hope that it all kind of comes out in the wash. And we're like, oh, okay, it looks like most everybody did all right. So let's put that in the corner. Let's table that. We get to that later. And every study says the same thing. More research is needed. And of course, more research never comes, because what is that even going to look like?
We are to assume that it's very similar to a power lifter, then actually, Joel, I would 100% agree with you that is idiotic. Maybe in some really off-season block where they're trying to get big and jacked and then they could just taper off and never hit those weights again, maybe that's okay. But I would agree with you, Joel. The problem, though, is the verbiage that you use to kind of then say that ATG squatting is the most injurious. It's that bridging of that gap that, for me, it's just a no-go. It's just I can't do that.
I work with a lot of college, pro, high school athletes, and I'm always, hey, what do you guys do for your training? I always inquire about that. And essentially, if the strength coach believes in astrograph squats, they are doing heavy loaded astrograph squats. It's not like, oh, some of them do a little smarter. It's like literally when I say probably.
Okay, that's true. And this is actually, because if I start getting into the specifics about what coaches tend to do, what's typically done, this is why I said this is where Joel looks the best, because I actually am inclined to agree with him. When you see prescriptions, I remember this in football. My high school was, we weren't great as far as our coaching, but it was more privileged than a lot. We had a lot of money in our football program. They had the programs that we were supposed to follow. The level of supervision that goes on is minimal, and you get a bunch of teenagers that get into a pissing contest and just want to see what they can do. And it goes on into college. Like, you could see the shit videos that get passed around where a college football player is trying to set a clean record. It's like the grossest, most pointless thing you've ever seen. It's like, you want to talk about injurious. What was the guy that was doing the hang clean with 475, and he would barely squeeze the bar through, and it would fold his wrists back, and his feet were wide apart. He would barely dip under the bar. And then on his heaviest attempt, his arm snapped or something. That's the type of shit you see. So I don't know what the responsibility is for us to look at individual protocols through the lens of, well, football coaches or sports coaches or athletes are going to fuck it up. So let's use that as the assumption that determines how we grade this one thing. I do know that kids left to their own devices, that's the type of shit they do. So it sounds like what Zach's saying, and what he does from an Olympic lifting background, everything, you have to build skill, you have to be able to get comfortable in those movements, you have to build proficiency, and you don't just go heavy all the time. There's a reason for an athlete to max out a squat. Maxing out a squat is specific to maxing out a squat. The type of strength you get doing that is not more substantial, more important for the field than the type of strength you get from running through different percentages through different amounts of volume. So there is eventually a trade-off when you consider what the skill is with the average athlete, which is pretty fucking low. And this goes back to what I was saying before, which is that it's not obvious that a full squat is actually needed for most athletes. I'm not saying it's bad. I don't agree with Joel's statements on it. I think he's way out of pocket. But it does beg the question, if you are likely to have a bunch of athletes who are limited, they're going to be ego-driven. They're not going to maintain proper form. They're going to just get under it and go. Is there greater risk with doing that? And is the trade-off of doing it so important that you have them do that anyways? That's not obvious to me. Again, sprinters, football players, people that jump and run, they need big, strong legs and glutes. But how big? How strong? In what capacity do they need to be as strong as possible? Is the difference between dunking it, is that so much of a better developmental stressor that we shouldn't really worry about risk or acknowledge if that exists at all? I don't really know. And I'm really mad that Joel's the one bringing this up, because I don't want to agree with Joel on anything.
Probably 100% of it, and I'm talking dozens of high school kids or dozens of high schools that have dealt with in kids, colleges. It's almost like, it would be great if a lot of strength coaches were doing it as intelligent as you are in terms of kind of differentiating between, hey, we're going to go heavy and loaded under these conditions, and we're going to go maybe a lot lighter and a little bit more systematic under these deep astrograph positions. Unfortunately, in a perfect world, that would be great, but I don't see that, and it's just something that I wish strength coaches would get those nuances, but they don't. So I'm kind of speaking to the broad audience of that.
There's another guy. He used to be the Australian rugby strength coach. He had a bunch of different names. Now he's not even in the strength and conditioning field anymore. But he would make a lot of memes on these football coaches, football strength and conditioning coaches. And he would have the exact same approach that you would, Joel. The thing is, though, he's not the biggest fan of you. And the reason
what's his name?
His name is Kurt. Kurt Wenham Flat. He's one of my friends, and he's not the biggest fan of you, even though he's fighting the same fight you are. So this is where it's like, ultimately, like many of these debates are going to end up is like, yes, we agree. There is a major flaw with the way that sports performance is taught on these like mass scale. But having said that, there's a lot of really cool stuff. I've seen some really cool and smart individuals in this. And I can actually, I can send you some Instagrams of like some really great football strength coaches. They squat their guys. They squat them to slightly below parallel. Maybe it's hard to determine what ass to grass is. Again, we brought this up before. Is ass to grass 140 degree, but they do squat them, and they're smart about recovery, and they're smart about planning. They're smart about the macro cycle. So there's goodness in there. I'm not sure that the fight against the badness is the absolute statements. And again, inherently, I think you and I are going to disagree on that. This is you with no filter, just saying what you're saying.
Those are fair points too. And again, I know strength coaches in this industry who do things a little bit differently than me, and I learn from them. So when people are like, man, you got to keep an open, like I'm always trying to keep an open mind. The day I stop learning is the day I stop improving, and I'm just going to get worse. So I'm always open to seeing what other strength coaches are doing. Like you said, there's a ton of.
That is 100% not true. And this is also when you're debating somebody, you have to keep in mind how locked in are they to the things that they've presented so far? Because when people have an ideology and they build a living around it, they lose the ability. Like they fundamentally don't have the ability to change their mind. Joel Seedman can't go back on anything he said. He's made so much money. He can't evolve. He has a brand around him. The people that have followed him to this point for what he's done wouldn't tolerate an evolution. He especially can't go back to anything that is more run of the mill, that is more generic. Like he just can't. And this is a big problem. This is why you have to start. You can't have the stubbornness. You have to start from a premise of this is what I know. There's always more information, and I have to be able to adjust as I go. And that has to be part of your branding. I like to think I know a lot of shit. I've been doing this for a long time. This is the only thing I'm really qualified to do. I can't fix a house. I'm useless working on my car. I'm barely a man when it comes to my utility out in the world. This is what I know how to do. There is still shit that I get wrong. And I'm speaking in front of a camera. I have thousands of hours of me speaking in front of a camera. I've said some shit wrong. I've said some shit. Somebody points it out and they're like, you know what, bro? Like I fact checked you and it looks like you're a little behind on that. And I have to put my foot in my mouth. It has to be like, you know what, bro, you're right. Like that's the only way you maintain that integrity. Someone like Seedman just physically cannot engage in that process. He has dug himself into a hole that is too deep.
Great content out there. I would say that's the minority.
Do you feel like Ben Patrick has had a net negative on the health of the kinesiology of modern culture? And their knees specifically, which is the main focus?
Yeah, no, definitely not. Because again, if you look at kind of the different elements of that, like we said, the slow eccentrics, the isometrics, the tibialis emphasis of the shins, which I've been a huge fan of for a long time. I think you get a ton of benefit. Every athlete, every human for that matter, get benefit from that. Working the hip flexors, which I think is underutilized a lot. Loading the hamstrings. A lot of foot and ankle activation work, which he does.
The metabolite training with the sled, like literally just conditioning that extension of the knee.
Exactly. So those are all like huge, benefits to the industry. And I honestly I've always been a big fan of shin work, hip flexors, Nordic hamstrings to an extent. I learned from Ben. I'm like, man, I'm going to start doing even more of this. And I put it online like, hey, Ben Patrick does some great stuff. We disagree on what constitutes his optimal range of motion. But he's doing some amazing things that I've learned from that.
What could you have possibly learned from Ben Patrick? His entire angle is maximizing knee flexion. That's like his brand. That's his entire thing. What could you have possibly learned from Ben Patrick? I don't want to say it's a gimmick because I think there's a lot of validity to it. And it's true. Like joints have to be exposed to a range to be strong in that range. You get as strong as you want in a partial range. You take yourself out of that range and maximize the load, you're in fucking trouble, which is why it's a problem that you acknowledge in the beginning that athletes get put into bad positions, but you are advocating for literally no work. You tepidly signed off on body weight squats, but no work to load you in that position. That's insane. That's insane. I've known guys that can literally quarter squat 1,500 pounds and you can still be riddled with tendinitis. You can still get all the, in fact, you want to talk about heavy overloaded partials? That's been like all I've done for like 2 decades. I do probably more elevated deads, more yoke picks, farmer picks, things like that are partial than I've done full range shit. And I can tell you that when I'm feeling beat up, it's the heavy ass partials that absolutely feel the worst. Not only that, but they make it close to impossible to function in any other aspect of training. Again, squatting full range, self-limiting. It's not as hard on your nervous system. It's not easy, but not as hard. It actually is biomechanically friendly because it's what we're designed to do. A deadlift, we're not exactly designed to pick up weight that way. The stressor on the spinal erectors is pretty extreme. It's a relatively small muscle. It's doing a big load. It's really disadvantaged. That shit blows you out. But squatting full range, lightweight, biomechanically friendly, you can function as an athlete while doing that. You want to start talking about overloaded partials? Push the limit on that, man, and good luck on any of your sprint training within like 48 hours.
Personally have implemented.
So your beef largely is the bilateral squat position over the like a lunge position. So if a person, because a lot of Ben stuff is, I don't know what his exact prescription is, but some percentage of body weight going into that deep knees over toes lunge position, which would seem to kind of go against a lot of what I think it would go against a lot of your philosophies. But like how do you feel from the lens of a lunge?
Yeah, it's just gonna.
I don't know if you can hear that. My dogs are howling. As soon as this kid comes, they're all out of here. They're all gone. Put them in the wagon, ship them off to the meat plant.
Open up another can of worms here, but I'm not a fan of that movement either. But I personally don't. I would kind of put that in the same category as the squat. Again, I think a lot of what Ben does is great. I don't personally like that exercise. So just getting a little bit into some of the science of the stretching under those conditions and those positions.
We got the science.
When you
All
overstretch a muscle, one of the responses is that it comes back tighter and it comes back with a vengeance. It's a protective mechanism in our bodies. It's basically the stretch reflex, but there's various forms of that. And it's there to protect us so that we don't come back and overstretch in the future. That's why a lot of people that do stretching, well, what's the thing that they feel compelled to do about 30 minutes later? Stretch again because the muscles came back tighter. Feels good for 10, 15, 20 minutes, maybe even 30 minutes. But at some point, whether it's 30 minutes later, a few hours later, it's going to come back tighter. Then they're going to have to stretch it again.
But you can change the constitution. You can change the constitution of the sarcomeres and the myofibrils and the actual, like the physical structural composition. Sarcomerogenesis does manifest as a product of ongoing stress. Suddenly, your muscle.
Is he making the case that loading yourself through greater range of motion on a regular basis will make you more tight and more bound? He can't believe that. How many examples are like, you don't need to have like a deep amount of insight. You don't have to have a ton of experience with all the different facets of sport. Take Olympic lifters that have squatted 700, 800, 900 pounds, the strongest men on the planet. The feats of strength that they can do are insane. Are they tighter? What about gymnasts? The loading they do in these extraordinarily compromised positions, are they tighter? So the solution is to not stretch the muscle. I'm at a loss for words. Let's
fibers say, holy shit, this guy, we need more sarcomere. Like we need more length.
Right.
And that's why it's problematic to say like wear high heels all the time. Like you can actually change the constitution of your ankles and your hips.
Oh yeah. No, you can slightly alter the length tension relationship of the muscles left or right. Now it's pretty small to the point that like, okay, somebody instead of their optimal biomechanical leverage being at 90 degrees, for example, at like if they're holding like a bicep curl, it might change it to like 92, 93 degrees. It's not like all of a sudden they're going to go to like, oh man, this guy's been training extreme range of motion. So now his biomechanical optimal is like 130 degrees. That's not going to happen. So it can change it a little bit. But the biggest thing when it comes to the strength curve, if we want to really change it, is we got to elevate it. We just got to gain more strength, right? I mean, that's the biggest thing. And so it's not like we're going to change the shape of it that much. We're not going to change it to the left or right a whole lot. There's some research to show that long lever or long eccentric long positions can shift it a little bit to the right. But if we can elevate that strength curve and gain strength, that's how we're going to be able to handle more loads, more force in all positions, not just 90 or not just at short positions or long. Because again, that inverted U, that length.
Also, he was talking about actual muscle lengths. Where's the discussion about the actual tendon? Because when you're talking about injuries, that's what you're typically talking about, especially a field athlete who's like changing direction very quickly. I mean, the forces they experience are just absolutely insane. And you have to sufficiently load a tendon, and it has to be at a rate that's like very slow and very progressed in order to do it right, because they take so fucking long to get strong. It's like stupid. But from what I have heard, the talking point that gets passed around is that shearing forces tend to be highest on the patellar tendon right at 90 degrees, which is where Joel's telling people to change direction. And it's not just about where you experience load, it's about what's going on at that point, because pausing at a point is different than lowering or raising at that point. If you change direction at the bottom and you have good mobility in your position and you're stable, you can use a compression and a little bit of rebound from the stretch reflex, and you can get a nice even start going at a point where the shearing forces aren't quite as high on those joints. And then if you're experiencing load halfway up at that typical point, it doesn't matter so much about those forces halfway up. But if you're changing direction, if that's where you're changing direction, those forces get really high and they can very easily outpace what you're able to handle. A lot of guys get into strongman. Again, it starts out with heavy overloaded shit. You get strong in partials extremely quick. The more simple and compact a movement is, the faster you're going to make jumps in weight. And it leads you to believe that you've kind of generally gotten stronger than you actually have. But if you immediately jump to that too soon, I mean, it makes my knees hurt thinking about it. But that adaptation is like so crucial. And I think it's like, I don't know how you could say Ben Patrick has done a bunch of good stuff, but I disagree with his deep lunges and squatting, which is the foundation of everything he says about how to get your patellar tendon strong.
Tension relationship. It's the same for all humans.
What else you got, Zach? You said you got.
So here's my proposition, Joe. Joe, the evil twin.
Yeah.
So here's my proposition, Joel. I would like to do 4 weeks of 90-degree eccentric isometrics. If you will do 4 weeks of ATG with eccentric, with isometric, but I like to call them resting pauses. And we can determine whether it is 8 workouts or 12 workouts. So 2 times a week squatting or 3 times a week squatting. 20 minutes per session, maybe more, 20 to 30, maybe 40 minutes per session. You do it, you do the ATG, and I'll do that. Again, this is not something, you don't have to implement this with anyone else. This is just you and me.
Yeah. So
would you be interested in this?
No.
I will program for you.
Okay.
You will program for me.
Who programs for me? I got to be involved in this.
Well, Aaron, I think you should do both. You should do both.
Good. Very good.
Actually, it would be nice though if I could do it with a partner. That'd be great.
All right. Yeah. The small caveats in there, I can tell you just from previous experience of when I had big injuries, if I start doing heavy ass to grass barbell squats, it's going to start messing with my back. So.
You have to trust that I'm going to load you properly. You said the word heavy. I did not say the word heavy.
All right,
this is simply the modality of the ATG squat.
Okay.
The load is something completely different.
Okay.
So I'm not going to overload you.
There's no way.
I'm going to bring you in now.
There's no way. Like it's like I just cover this. Like he has literally nothing to gain from this. He doesn't want to back out because he's kind of getting put on the spot here, but he has absolutely nothing to gain from this. And he has everything to lose. Like there's no way he would go through this. Think of how dramatic the changes would have to be for Joel to say, wow, I went through that cycle and it was better than I thought. Think of what it would be just for him to say, it wasn't as bad as I made it out to be. It doesn't even have to be a radical transformation. For him to not find issue with it, that's the cost of that is the entire brand that he set up for himself right now. And that's what I said before, like he's in a corner. He has nowhere to move, to grow, to evolve, to implement new ideas or things without chipping away at the base of everything that he's built up to this point. And by the way, Joel's balling. I don't know if you know how lucrative it is to get hundreds of thousands of people believe that your silly off-center bullshit is actually worth something. This guy makes fucking bank. I can tell you that right now. There is no chance he's going to risk any of that to run through this. And if he does, I mean, God, talk about like bias. I mean, that's like the worst experiment you could run. He has every reason half-ass workouts. He has every reason to get sick, to get a tweak. He has no incentive to have it go out the way he wants. It's a fun challenge. I like where Zach's head is at here. But there's no way he's going to commit to this. And if anything, I feel like Joel could absolutely leverage it to his advantage. Keep in mind, and this is again, the friendliness. I think it's kind of cool that people can get together and talk. That's important. That's an important standard to hold. But Zach has literally like attacked Joel for like years. He's called him his mortal enemy. He's done a lot of videos, as have I. I mean, I haven't called him that, but I've done videos on Joel being full of shit. And now it's like this buddy challenge. There's still so many things you can pinpoint about Joel's methodologies that are just so fucking bad that I'm gonna say it. Like I don't necessarily think these two did a horrible job with this by any stretch, but this went about as good as I think Joel could have expected. Like he can 100% take this challenge and tweak it to his benefit. I mean, let's see if he will. I doubt he'd even start it.
Nice and easy.
Okay.
And then you and I will meet up at the end of this and we will have a chat.
Awesome. All right.
Really? You'll do that, Joel?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I love that. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't want to go below parallel.
Okay.
So
all right.
And I know you don't have a problem with that. So I want to do 90-degree eccentric isometrics. I want to see how I feel at the end of 8.
Now, the funny thing would be if Zach does this good faith, and because Zach does have awkward leverages for squatting, if the shift of training exclusively in an advantage position like blows up Zach's lower body, which I could absolutely see happening. And this is, again, it's a point of controversy. Like if you're using squats as a means to an end, it isn't obvious that in all cases, ass to grass, it's a great base. I am biased towards ass to grass, towards deep squatting. It's fantastic. There's a lot of good strongmen. There's a lot of good powerlifters that have gotten exceptionally strong, limiting the range of motion. There's bodybuilders who will specifically cut the range of motion to keep stress on a particular muscle. As long as you're loading and as long as something's going on in the muscle, you can get stronger in that movement pattern. You can grow that muscle. It can have some general like global carryover to other things. Oh, this was such a bad move. Zach's going to be like half squatting like 600 pounds in fucking no time. And he's going to come back and he's going to dunk 500 like it's a toy. I would not be surprised if that's what happened. Oh, man.
8 workouts over the course of 4 weeks. I want you to do ATG squats over the course of 4 weeks, 8 workouts. And then Aaron's going to hop in with me. What a fun exercise.
This is cool. This feels like progress. Yeah. Not towards anyone being right or wrong, but just people connecting. I'm a hippie.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
Very cool.
I get it. I love love.
All right.
I like it. Awesome.
Oh, that took a turn, guys. Oh, that took a turn. Yeah, I was really surprised by how that went out. It is. Like, I appreciate, given how much people scream at each other, whatever, this is pretty low stakes shit, too. I mean, we all get on our high horse about, like, railing against fitness influencers. Like, it really is some big thing. It's not nearly as big of a worldly problem as we like to make it out to be. It's big in our world. But, man, I'm a little bit for people being wrong. I'm a little bit for that. Joel, I think there's a bloodlust I have that just did not get satisfied. Let's go back to more Joel videos. Here we go. Boom. Yeah, get that chaos training, boy. 405, shaky as fuck. What injuries? What tweaks? Just nothing but maximum gain. It's specific. I mean, this is specific training. I mean, you got to give it up to the king of sport specificity. You do not want to do anything that does not look like what you are going to do on the field. Yeah, this was a big one. Yeah, no. Hey, things are going to hit your helmet. When you're trying to pay attention to what the quarterback is calling, You know, there's going to be birds and shit that are like just distracting you. Oh, hey, you're stretching a little bit too much here, guy. Don't you know that that makes you tighter? Where's this one? This one actually triggered me. This one just like actually ruined my... Oh, here it is. The strongest lifters use 90 degrees. Whew, this one broke my brain. This one absolutely broke my brain. Again, man, look at those. It's so elegant. Where's the classical music? The strongest lifters, again, throwing around terminology without any regard of what it actually means, what the ideas behind them are. What does it mean to be the strongest? Does it mean just to move the weight? You can't talk about strength without context of where that strength is being applied. What is the task? What is the thing we use to determine strength? These guys lift this way because they lift in equipped federations where you're either heavily supported or you're otherwise limiting the range to a point where you can handle the maximal poundages. Does that make them the strongest? Again, it's that circular thing. They limit range of motion, which allows them to lift more weight, which makes them definitionally the strongest. I mean, how does their strength line up with the type of strength an Olympic lifter would have? Like, how do you compare? What's the exchange rate? It doesn't fucking exist.